The whole neighborhood laughed and told him he was wasting what little time he had left. An old veteran living quietly in his red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket built a second roof over his small cabin as winter closed in on Montana. They said one roof was enough. 2 roofs would only bring danger. Then the worst blizzard in decades swept through the mountains. Roofs collapsed, homes failed, families ran into the night, but his cabin did not fall. When his loyal German shepherd began howling in the screaming wind, the town realized something chilling. The one place they had mocked was now the only place still warm. What this veteran understood, they had refused to hear, and the storm was about to teach them the price of ignoring hard-earned wisdom. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below. It's always incredible to see how far these stories of survival and resilience travel. Winter sealed Missoula under heavy snow and knife-edged mountain wind, turning every breath into frost and every sound into something brittle and hollow. Frank Miller lived on the northern edge of town, where the paved road surrendered to gravel and then to nothing at all in a small cedar plank cabin, crouched against a pine-covered slope, as if it had learned over many years how to make itself smaller before the cold. Frank was 73, tall once but now slightly bent at the shoulders, his frame still solid beneath age-worn muscle, the kind that did not come from gyms but from decades of carrying weight when no one asked if it was fair. His face was deeply lined, angular, with a strong, square jaw, softened by time, a broken nose that had never quite healed straight, and a short, uneven gray beard that he trimmed himself with a dull razor. His eyes were a pale winter blue, watchful, and distant, the eyes of a man who had learned to measure the world before trusting it. He wore the same thick red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket. Every day the wool heavy and frayed at the cuffs, smelling faintly of wood smoke and pine resin, a jacket that had outlasted wars, marriages, and friends. Frank had served as a combat engineer decades earlier, a job that taught him how structures failed before they collapsed, and how men failed long before they admitted it. A roadside explosion overseas had taken 2 men from his unit and left Frank buried under debris for nearly an hour, breathing through a fist-sized pocket of trapped air until rescue arrived. Since then, he had never underestimated empty space. He spoke little to his neighbors, not because he disliked them, but because words had become something he rationed carefully, like firewood in January. People in Missoula described him as quiet, but polite, stubborn, but fair, a man who nodded instead of waved and listened more than he answered. The only constant presence in his life was Rex, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a thick sable coat streaked in black and silver, a broad chest, scarred muzzle, and intelligent amber eyes that seemed always alert even when he slept. Rex had been trained as a search and rescue dog before an injury ended his service, and that training never left him. He moved with deliberate purpose, ears rotating at every sound, body positioned instinctively between Frank and whatever approached. To Frank, Rex was not a pet, but a companion, the one living creature who understood silence without demanding it. As autumn faded and the first serious storms loomed, the rest of the neighborhood rushed to finish winter preparations. Roofs were patched, shingles replaced beams, reinforced in the traditional way, with men like Bill Anderson overseeing much of it. Bill was in his late 50s, broad-shouldered, barrel-chested, with a thick brown mustache flecked with gray, and a booming laugh that carried across the clearing. He had built or repaired half the cabins in that part of Missoula, and took pride in his efficiency, his belief that simple methods were best. Bill liked Frank well enough, but regarded him as a man stuck in old habits, a veteran who saw problems where none existed. That was why Bill nearly dropped his coffee mug the morning he saw Frank hauling extra timber up onto his finished roof. Frank had already completed a solid, properly pitched cedar shingle roof, neat and tight, the kind any inspector would approve without question. Now he was measuring and marking points above it, driving vertical posts into the existing beams with slow, methodical precision. Bill called out, half joking, half concerned, asking what in God's name Frank thought he was doing. Frank did not look down. He adjusted his measuring tape, checked the distance again, and replied calmly that he was building a second roof. Laughter followed, not cruel but dismissive, the laughter of men, certain they already knew the answer. Bill shook his head and told him one roof kept snow out just fine, two roofs only meant twice the weight when winter came hard. Another neighbor, Sarah Whitman, paused on her way back from the well to watch. Sarah was in her early 40s, tall and lean with weather-toughened skin, dark blonde hair pulled into a practical braid, and sharp green eyes that missed very little. She was widowed, having lost her husband to a logging accident 5 winters earlier, and that loss had carved a quiet self-reliance into her posture. She didn't laugh, but her brow furrowed with concern. Frank noticed her expression and offered a small nod, acknowledging, without explaining. Inside, his thoughts were anything but calm. He remembered the sound of metal screaming under pressure, the way structures warned you before they failed if you knew how to listen. He remembered the suffocating darkness under collapsed concrete and the miracle of breathing warmed air trapped where it should not have been. Those memories were not dramatic to him. They were instructional. As he worked, he calculated load distribution, spacing his supports so the weight of the outer roof would be spread evenly, never pressing too hard on any single point. He knew the neighbors saw waste. He saw insurance. Rex lay on the snow-dusted ground below, head on his paws, eyes tracking Frank's movements, occasionally lifting his head to watch the wind bend the treetops. When a gust rattled loose boards from a nearby shed, Rex rose and barked once, sharp and low, then settled again, reassured by Frank's steady presence above. Frank worked alone for days, his breath steaming, fingers numbing. Despite heavy gloves, his joints aching in ways he did not complain about. At night, sitting by the fire, he stared at the ceiling and imagined the airspace that would soon exist above it still, and protected a buffer between life and the indifference of winter. He knew people thought he was afraid, that age had made him cautious to the point of foolishness. The truth was simpler and harder to explain. He trusted physics more than optimism, experience more than tradition. When Bill passed by again and repeated his warnings, Frank finally met his eyes and said quietly that roofs didn't fail because they were unlucky. They failed because someone assumed yesterday's weather was tomorrow's promise. Bill frowned, uncomfortable with the seriousness in Frank's voice, and walked on. By the end of the week, the outline of a second roof frame stood clearly above the first, an odd skeletal crown that drew stares and whispers. Children dared each other to throw snowballs at it. Adults shook their heads and muttered about old soldiers and strange ideas. Frank heard none of it directly, but he felt it in the way conversations stopped when he passed. It did not bother him. Rex followed him back into the cabin that evening, snow clinging to his fur, and lay down near the door, content. Frank fed him, stoked the fire, and sat in his chair, listening to the wind rise, thinking not of proving anyone wrong, but of staying alive when the mountains decided to test them all. The ridicule did not arrive all at once, but settled around Frank Miller's cabin, the way frost crept across glass, quietly, persistently, until it became impossible to ignore. Each morning as he climbed onto the roof, boots crunching against thin ice, he could feel eyes on his back. Bill Anderson made no effort to hide his disapproval anymore. He would stand with his hands on his hips, thick fingers hooked into his tool belt, watching Frank work as if observing a slow-motion accident. Bill's voice, naturally loud, carried easily across the clearing when he spoke to others, and words, like overbuilt, unnecessary, and dangerous, floated through the cold air with the same regularity as wood smoke. Frank never answered. He had learned long ago that explanations given too early were usually wasted. Instead, he measured, cut, and fastened with deliberate care his movements, economical, almost ritualistic, each action grounded in calculation rather than impulse. The second roof frame began to take shape, rising evenly above the first, supported by vertical posts spaced with mathematical precision. To the untrained eye, it looked excessive, even reckless. To Frank, it looked calm. Sarah Whitman watched more closely than most. She often paused on her way back from the river, or the supply shed, standing straight-backed, despite the cold, her tall, slender frame wrapped in a faded gray coat that hung loosely from her narrow shoulders. Her hair, dark blonde threaded with ash, was usually braided tightly down her back, not out of vanity, but practicality, and her face bore the quiet sharpness of someone who had learned to read danger early. Since her husband's death, Sarah had developed a habit of observing structures, trees, roofs, even people, with an instinctive sense for what might fail. She noticed how Frank's supports were not simply nailed, but reinforced with angled braces, how he adjusted the pitch of the outer roof, just slightly steeper than the inner one. She did not fully understand what he was building, but she recognized intention when she saw it. Rex, meanwhile, had grown accustomed to the strange rhythm of construction. The dog was large even for his breed, with powerful hindquarters and a thick neck that flared into a heavy ruff of fur. His coat darkening along the spine and lightening at the legs. His injured shoulder made him favor one side slightly when he ran, but it did nothing to dull his alertness. He patrolled the perimeter of the cabin with quiet authority, occasionally lifting his head to scent the air, reacting not just to sound, but to pressure changes that humans could not feel. Frank noticed Rex's behavior more than he noticed his neighbor's. When the dog lingered near the western tree line, watching the sky longer than usual, Frank made a mental note. Inside the cabin, nights grew colder. Frank sat by the fire and let his thoughts drift backward, not because he wanted to relive the war, but because memory had a way of surfacing when the body sensed danger. He remembered a winter deployment decades earlier, a temporary outpost hastily assembled from metal sheets and tarps. The cold had been relentless, the kind that invaded bones and stripped heat faster than men could generate it. One night, artillery fire collapsed part of the structure, trapping Frank and two others beneath twisted beams. One man panicked and burned through his oxygen in minutes. Frank had pressed his face against a pocket of trapped air, damp and warm compared to the freezing metal around them, and forced himself to breathe slowly. That air, motionless and unseen, had kept him alive until help arrived. Ever since, he had trusted stillness more than strength. He carried that lesson into everything he built. The townspeople did not know this. To them, Frank was simply an old veteran who refused to listen. Bill confronted him directly one afternoon, stepping closer than usual, his mustache stiff with frost, his breath puffing white between sentences. He warned Frank that inspectors would never approve such a structure, that added weight would compromise the beams, that snow loads in Montana were unforgiving. Frank listened patiently, nodding once at the end, and replied in a voice so even it unsettled Bill more than anger would have. He said that snow did not kill buildings. Misunderstanding did. He said weight was only dangerous when it was allowed to concentrate. Bill scoffed and walked away, muttering that stubbornness would be the death of him. Frank returned to his work without comment. As days passed, the mockery hardened into certainty among the neighbors. Conversations at the general store turned sharp whenever Frank's name came up. Some worried he would collapse his cabin and require rescue in the dead of winter, diverting resources from families who had prepared properly. Others laughed outright, calling the second roof a hat for an old man afraid of the cold. Frank heard about these remarks secondhand and felt a familiar tightening in his chest. Not of anger, but of isolation. He had lived long enough to know that being right too early often meant being alone. Sarah eventually spoke to him approaching one late afternoon while Rex gnawed on a stick near the porch. She stood a careful distance away, hands tucked into her coat sleeves, and asked, not accused, whether he was sure the cabin could handle the extra load. Frank studied her face, saw genuine concern rather than judgment, and answered more fully than he had with anyone else. He explained that the outer roof would bear the snow, that its steeper pitch would encourage shedding before accumulation became dangerous, that the inner roof would remain largely untouched by the weight above. He spoke of air as if it were a building material, describing how it trapped heat when undisturbed. Sarah listened without interrupting, her eyes narrowing slightly in concentration. When he finished, she nodded slowly and said she hoped he was right. It was not an endorsement, but it was not ridicule either, and Frank appreciated the difference. That night, as wind rattled the trees and the temperature dropped sharply, Frank lay awake listening to the familiar creaks of the cabin settling. Rex slept near the bed, one ear twitching at every sound. Frank placed a hand on the floor, feeling the faint vibration of gusts striking the walls, and imagined the space that would soon exist above him, a quiet layer of protection. He did not think about convincing anyone. He thought only about what winter would demand and whether he had answered properly. Outside clouds thickened over the mountains, and the air grew heavy with the promise of something worse than ordinary snow. February arrived without ceremony, only a strange stillness that settled over Missoula like a held breath, the kind Frank Miller recognized instinctively as the calm before something violent. The air grew dense, soundless, and even the trees seemed to stiffen in anticipation. On the morning the storm broke, the sky darkened to a dull iron gray, and the first winds rolled down from the mountains with a force that rattled windows and bent treetops as if testing their resolve. By noon, snow was no longer falling, but attacking, driven sideways in sheets so thick that the world beyond 20 feet simply vanished. Frank stood on his porch for a long moment, his red and black flannel jacket snapping sharply in the wind, his breath fogging the air as Rex pressed close to his leg, hackles, raised eyes locked on the white chaos beyond the clearing. The sound of the storm reminded Frank of incoming artillery, not the explosion itself, but the sustained roar that preceded it, a noise that told you escape was no longer an option. He went back inside, secured the door, and moved with calm efficiency, adjusting vents, checking fastenings, making sure the cabin was ready to endure what was coming. As the hours passed, the storm intensified beyond anything the town had experienced in decades. Winds exceeded 90 miles per hour, screaming through the valley like a living thing, while temperatures plunged far below zero, the kind of cold that burned exposed skin in seconds. Snow accumulated at a terrifying rate, piling upon roofs, pressing down with a relentless, crushing weight. Across the settlement, Frank could hear distant cracks echo through the stormwood beams, surrendering under stress, followed by muffled shouts, swallowed almost instantly by the wind. In one nearby cabin, the Johnson family was thrown from sleep when their ceiling sagged visibly, snow pouring through seams, as their father, a stocky man in his 40s, with a perpetually worried brow, screamed for everyone to get out. They fled into the night, half-dressed faces numb, dragging children through chest-deep drifts toward whatever shelter might still be standing. Similar scenes played out again and again, unseen but unmistakable, each structural failure announcing itself with a sharp, rifle-like crack that made Frank's jaw tighten. Inside his own cabin, however, the difference was almost eerie. The outer roof absorbed the brunt of the storm, its steeper pitch forcing snow to slide off in heavy avalanches that thudded harmlessly to the ground, while the inner roof remained quiet, untouched by the weight above. Frank moved through the small space, hand brushing the interior ceiling, feeling its steady warmth, the temperature holding, as if the storm were happening somewhere very far away. Rex paced once, then settled near the hearth, his large body curled protectively, ears flicking at each new sound, but without panic. The dog trusted the structure the way he trusted Frank, with a calm born of experience rather than hope. By the second night, the storm showed no sign of weakening. Power lines failed, plunging the town into darkness, and fires burned low in cabins where families rationed wood, afraid they would run out before the cold relented. Frank listened as the wind howled through the gaps between trees, his mind cataloging each noise, each vibration, assessing rather than fearing. He thought of Bill Anderson, stubborn and proud, and wondered whether the man's carefully built roof was holding under this kind of sustained load. He thought of Sarah Whitman, tall and quiet, her narrow house closer to the river, more exposed to drifting snow. He did not feel satisfaction at the thought that his own cabin was holding when others might not. Instead, a familiar heaviness settled in his chest, the same weight he had felt after battles survived while others were lost. Near dawn on the third day, a sound cut through the storm that made even Rex rise to his feet, a deep, resonant crack followed by a prolonged groan of stressed timber. Frank knew that sound well. Somewhere nearby, a roof had failed catastrophically. He opened the door briefly, bracing himself against the wind, and scanned the white void, seeing nothing but movement and shadow. The cold slammed into him instantly, stealing breath, forcing him back inside within seconds. He closed the door and leaned against it, heart pounding, not from fear but from recognition. This was the moment he had built for. Throughout the storm, Frank's cabin became a point of quiet stability amid destruction. Snow buried the walls halfway up, but the interior remained dry and livable. The air between the roofs doing exactly what he had designed it to do, holding warmth, resisting the invasive cold. He burned far less firewood than his neighbors, adding small measured logs, only when necessary, conserving resources without discomfort. Rex remained vigilant, occasionally lifting his head to growl softly when particularly violent gusts struck the outer roof, then relaxing again when the structure held. By the fourth night, exhaustion took its toll on the town. Families trapped in damaged cabins huddled together, listening to beams creak ominously overhead, knowing that sleep might mean not waking at all. Frank sat at his table, hands wrapped around a tin mug, thinking not of survival as an abstract concept, but as a series of decisions made long before the storm arrived. He understood now more clearly than ever that the ridicule he had endured was a small price compared to the cost of being unprepared. The blizzard raged on, relentless and merciless, reshaping the landscape and exposing the fragile assumptions beneath ordinary life. And while the storm had not yet reached its worst one, truth was already undeniable. The strange second roof that had inspired laughter now stood between life and death, its value proven not by argument, but by endurance. The first knock came just after nightfall, muffled by wind and snow, hesitant at first, and then frantic, the sound of gloved fists striking Frank Miller's door with the desperation of people who had run out of options. Frank did not hesitate. He rose from his chair, joints stiff but steady, and opened the door into a wall of white and screaming air. A family stumbled forward immediately, half-blinded, half-frozen, clinging to one another as if the storm itself were trying to tear them apart. At the front was Bill Anderson, his broad shoulders hunched, his once booming voice reduced to a rasp. The confidence that usually sat so comfortably on his face was gone. Frost clung to his mustache. His cheeks burned red and raw, and his eyes, normally sharp with certainty, were wide with something close to fear. Behind him were his wife, Marianne, a round-faced woman with kind eyes now rimmed red from cold and tears, and their 2 children bundled so heavily they could barely walk. Frank stepped aside without a word, waving them in. The moment they crossed the threshold, the contrast hit them like a physical blow. Steam rose from their coats as the warmth wrapped around them, unnatural and miraculous in the middle of such a storm. Bill staggered, bracing himself against the wall, and for a moment he could only stare, his breath hitching, as if his body could not reconcile what it was feeling. Rex moved forward calmly, sniffing each newcomer tail low, but relaxed, his massive presence oddly reassuring. More knocks followed. They came in waves, as if word had spread through the chaos that one light still burned against the mountain. Sarah Whitman arrived next, her tall frame bent forward against the wind, her braids stiff with ice, her face pale but composed. She carried a bundled child from another household, a little girl with dark curls plastered to her forehead, her small body trembling uncontrollably. Sarah's jaw was set with determination, the same expression she had worn at her husband's funeral, a look forged by loss and survival rather than hope. Frank took the child, gently ushered them inside, and guided them toward the fire. Soon came the Johnsons, then an elderly couple from down the slope, then neighbors Frank barely knew by name. Some arrived with blankets, others with nothing at all. By midnight, more than 20 people filled the cabin, every inch of space claimed by bodies pressed close together. It should have become unbearable, damp and freezing, as heat escaped into the storm. Instead, the temperature held steady and almost defiant. The air felt thick but warm, not stifling, not cold, just alive. Frank moved among them, quietly, redistributing space, adding a single log to the fire when needed, never more. He spoke when spoken to, answering questions without pride. When Bill finally found his voice, it shook as he asked how this was possible, how a cabin meant for one man and a dog could hold so many, and still feel like spring compared to the world outside. Frank rested a hand against the ceiling and told him simply that still air did not travel. That warmth stayed where wind could not reach it. He explained how the outer roof took the punishment of the storm, how the space between the roofs trapped heat the way a wool blanket trapped the body's warmth. Bill listened, nodding slowly, each word landing like a confession he had not yet spoken aloud. Hours blurred together. Outside, the storm howled on unrelenting, but inside the cabin, a strange quiet settled in. People slept, sitting up, leaned against walls wrapped around children. Rex stationed himself near the door, his head up, eyes open, a silent sentinel. Sometime near dawn, a woman cried out sharply, the sound cutting through the murmur of the wind. It was Emily Patterson, small and dark-haired, barely in her 20s, her face slick with sweat despite the cold. She had been heavily pregnant when the storm hit, her husband lost earlier that night, when their roof collapsed, crushed before anyone could reach him. Sarah was at her side, instantly shedding her coat, her movements decisive and calm. Sarah had once trained as a nurse before marriage, and loss pulled her back to Missoula, and that knowledge now surfaced without hesitation. Frank cleared space near the fire, his expression grave but focused. Rex shifted closer, lying down near Emily's feet, his presence grounding in a way words could not be. The labor was long and frightening. The storm outside screaming as if to drown out new life. But inside the cabin, something ancient and powerful took hold. When the child finally arrived, a boy red-faced and furious at the world, his cry pierced the room, sharp and undeniable. For a moment, no one spoke. Even the wind seemed to pause. Then the cabin filled with quiet sobs, hands pressed to mouths, the raw release of people who had believed death was winning. Frank watched from a short distance, his chest-tight memories surfacing uninvited. He had seen life begin and end in worse places than this, but never had it felt so defiant. The fire crackled softly. The ceiling above remained warm to the touch. Outside, the blizzard still ruled the mountain, but inside something had shifted. Bill sat heavily on the floor afterward, his head bowed, his large hands clasped together as if in prayer. When he finally looked up at Frank, his eyes shone, stripped of pride. He said quietly that he had been wrong. He did not ask forgiveness outright, but the words carried it all the same. Frank nodded once, accepting without ceremony. He knew apologies offered in survival were different from those offered in comfort. As the storm stretched into another day, the cabin held. Bodies came and went in sleep and wakefulness, but the warmth endured. The second roof did its silent work above them, unseen but essential, a barrier not just against cold, but against despair. By the time the wind began to weaken, the truth was undeniable to everyone inside those walls. The thing they had mocked had become their refuge, and the old veteran they had dismissed had quietly saved them all. Spring did not arrive triumphantly in Missoula. It crept in quietly, as if aware of the damage it was uncovering. The thaw revealing broken roofs, warped beams, and lives permanently altered by the long winter. Snow retreated in uneven patches, exposing mud-splintered lumber and the outlines of cabins that no longer stood as they once had. Frank Miller watched this transformation from his porch, his red and black flannel jacket still wrapped around his broad frame, the fabric lighter now in the sun, but unchanged in purpose. He felt no pride in being right. What he felt was a heavy, complicated relief, the kind that came only after danger had passed and left room for reflection. Around him, the town moved slowly, people stepping carefully through the wreckage of assumptions as much as through the physical remains of their homes. Bill Anderson was among the first to approach Frank once the roads cleared enough for normal movement. He looked older than he had before the storm, his shoulders slumped slightly, his thick beard grown uneven during the weeks of chaos streaked heavily with gray. The easy confidence that once defined him had been reshaped by nights spent fearing the collapse of everything he thought he understood. Bill did not arrive with tools or demands, only with a folded piece of paper clutched in his rough hands, and a humility that sat awkwardly but honestly on his face. He asked if Frank would show him how to build the second roof properly. Frank studied him for a moment, then nodded and invited him inside. There were no speeches, no acknowledgement of past ridicule. Frank spread his old drawings across the table pages, yellowed with age, edges soft from handling diagrams marked with precise measurements, and small handwritten notes written decades earlier in cramped, disciplined script. He explained the logic patiently, not as a teacher asserting authority, but as a man sharing information that had once saved his own life. Bill listened with the intensity of someone relearning his craft, from the ground up, asking questions not to challenge but to understand. Word spread quickly. Sarah Whitman came next, her posture still tall, her braid looser, now her face marked by fatigue, but also by a new clarity. She had lost less than many, but she had seen enough to recognize that survival was not accidental. She listened quietly as Frank explained the principles, again occasionally glancing at Rex, who lay nearby, his aging body relaxed, his eyes half-lidded in the sun. Sarah did not ask for drawings immediately. Instead, she asked if Frank thought the design could be adapted for smaller homes near the river, where drifting snow and ice posed different challenges. Frank considered this carefully and admitted that adjustments would be needed, his willingness to say, "I don't know," lending even more weight to the things he did. Over the following weeks, the sound of rebuilding replaced the silence of recovery. Hammers rang out across the valley, but the rhythm was different now, slower, more deliberate. Cabins rose again, not identical to their former selves, but wiser with outer roofs lifted above inner ones. Air gaps measured carefully, pitches steepened to shed snow rather than invite it. Frank never charged for his help. When people pressed money into his hands, he returned it without comment, saying only that the knowledge had not been his to begin with. It had been passed down, learned the hard way, preserved, because forgetting had once meant death. A few newcomers arrived during this time as well, drawn by rumors of survival against impossible odds. One of them was Thomas Reed, a county building inspector from Helena, lean and sharp-featured. His dark hair always neatly combed, his manner precise to the point of stiffness. Thomas had built his career on enforcing standardized codes, trusting regulations more than stories. He arrived skeptical, clipboard in hand, but left changed. After inspecting several of the newly rebuilt cabins and Frank's original structure, he requested copies of the drawings, his tone shifting from bureaucratic distance to professional respect. He admitted that the storm had exposed gaps in existing standards, that lived experience sometimes outran written rules. Frank accepted this acknowledgement quietly, aware that institutional change moved slowly, but grateful it moved at all. Throughout it all, Rex remained close. The German shepherd had aged visibly over the winter, a touch of stiffness in his movements, a graying around his muzzle, but his presence remained steady. Children who once kept their distance now approached him cautiously, then with confidence resting small hands against his thick fur. Rex accepted the attention with dignity, tail wagging slowly, as if aware his role as guardian had extended beyond one man. Frank often watched these moments with a faint softening around his eyes. He had never been good with people in crowds, but he understood loyalty when he saw it. As the last of the snow melted, the town held a small gathering near the rebuilt homes, not a celebration exactly, but an acknowledgement. There were no banners, no speeches written in advance. Bill spoke briefly, his voice rough, admitting publicly that experience did not guarantee wisdom, and that arrogance could be just as dangerous as ignorance. Others followed, sharing stories of fierce survival and quiet gratitude. Frank stood to the side, hands in his pockets, Rex at his feet, uncomfortable with attention, but willing to endure it. When someone asked him what lesson the town should remember, Frank paused, looking out toward the mountains that still held streaks of snow in their shadows. He said that the cold did not care who you were or how long you had lived there. It respected preparation, not pride. He said that some truths were invisible until tested, and that listening before disaster struck was always cheaper than learning afterward. The crowd fell silent, not out of awe, but recognition. By the time summer fully arrived, Missoula had changed in ways that went beyond architecture. People spoke differently, now asked questions sooner, listened longer. Frank returned to his quieter routines, repairing his own fence, splitting wood for winters yet to come. He remained the same man, reserved, observant, unwilling to waste words, but the town no longer mistook silence for ignorance. His cabin stood, as it always had, two roofs, sheltering a modest life, not as a monument, but as a reminder. Wisdom, Frank knew, did not announce itself. It waited patient and unseen until the moment it was needed most. In the end, this story is not really about a roof or a storm or even survival. It is about a quiet kind of miracle, the kind that doesn't arrive with thunder or fire from the sky, but through wisdom placed gently in human hands long before it is needed. Frank's second roof was not magic. It was knowledge, patience, and humility. And yet when the blizzard came, it worked like a miracle. Perhaps that is how God most often moves in our lives, not by breaking the laws of nature, but by teaching someone somewhere to understand them in time. The space between those two roofs became more than insulation. It became protection. It became mercy. In our own lives, we all face storms we cannot see coming. Illness, loss, fear, loneliness. And so often the answers God gives us look strange at first. They may come through quiet people, simple ideas, or warnings we are tempted to ignore. But Scripture reminds us that God chooses the humble and the overlooked to carry His wisdom. If this story touched you, ask yourself, is there a voice in your life you've been dismissing? Is there a lesson God has already given you waiting patiently for you to trust it? If this message spoke to your heart, please share it with someone who may be facing their own storm right now. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. It helps this channel reach people who need these stories. And if you haven't yet, consider subscribing so you don't miss more real stories of faith, resilience, and quiet miracles. May God bless you, protect you, and keep you warm through every storm you face. May He grant you wisdom before the trial, strength during it, and peace afterward. And may His grace surround you today, tomorrow, and always.